Welcome, everyone. My name is Christina Moranci. I'm Mashtas Professor of Armenian Studies at Harvard University, and I want to welcome you to the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. And I'm delighted to introduce our speaker and moderator for today's event. And I want to say that I want also to thank my colleague here at the Davis Center, Zulfiya Abdurrahimova Karberi, for her hard work in making this event happen. So I'm going to begin by introducing the moderator for today's presentation. And that is Armen Manukaloyan, who is a doctoral student in history at Georgetown. And Armen's dissertation, tentatively titled Imperial Horizons, Ottoman Armenians at the Twilight of Empire, 1900 to 1914, is a social and cultural history of Ottoman Armenians at the turn of the 20th century. It examines how this numerically small, yet highly visible and socially and geographically mobile Christian community with uniquely transnational and trans-imperial ties in both the Ottoman and Russian empires perceived and responded to the challenges of an era beset by issues of race, identity, belonging, and sweeping political and societal change, and how they, along with other imperial citizens, set about reshaping the world around them. I want to turn now to our speaker, our main speaker for today, Dr. Pamela Steiner. Dr. Pamela Steiner is a senior fellow at the FXXB Center for Health and Human Rights, the Chan School of Public Health at Harvard University. And over the last 25 years, her work has been to contribute through Track 2 workshops to improving relations among Armenians, Turks, and Azerbaijanis, and between Jewish, Israelis, and Palestinians. Her bibliography includes her 2021 book, Collective Trauma and the Armenian Genocide, Armenian, Turkish, and Azerbaijani Relations since 1839. And in case you didn't know, her great-grandfather was Henry Morgenthau, U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. Dr. Steiner holds an Ed.D. in developmental psychology and an M.Ed. in counseling and consulting psychology from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, an M.A. in government from Harvard University, and a B.A. in philosophy from Smith College. Her doctoral dissertation focused on the development of the adult decision-making mind while working on what constitutes leadership in our challenging world, and Track 2 conflict resolution. She was a co-founder of the program on international conflict analysis and resolution at Harvard's Weatherhead Center of International Affairs from 1995 to 2003. She is certified both in group psychotherapy and a new approach to trauma healing, somatic experiencing. And for 12 years before that, she was a clinical instructor in psychology at Cambridge Hospital, Harvard Medical School. So with that, I would like to welcome both our speakers and turn it over to you both.
Thank you very much, Christina. Thank you, Davis Center, and also Zulfiya Abdurrahimova Karberi, who isn't here, but is the fellow at the Davis Center, who kindly responded with me to get this thing off the ground. And thank you to Armen, who came up from DC to moderate. Now, I want to convey today my entire thesis of a rather heavy book. So I plan to cover a lot of ground that includes 3 disciplines. And to present this ambitious effort, I am going to be simplifying. So I urge you to allow yourselves to listen intuitively, and we can push me to explain further in the discussion. The purpose of the book is based, my book that we're here today to discuss, is based on my years of work in the field of conflict resolution, particularly As Christina, I think, said, when I co-facilitated conflicts that remained immune to improvement over many decades. Overall, these conflict resolution processes, as convened and facilitated by some of the best and brightest, have nonetheless failed in their chief goal, which is to contribute to creating a sustainable basis for resolution. The purpose of my book is to contribute to the improvement of such facilitated processes so that they can achieve that goal of sustainable resolution. Conflict resolution processes I write about were first developed after World War II. They offered the potential to make a unique contribution for the transformation of destructive relationships into peaceful, productive, sustainable, respectful, and friendly ones. Now, this was new in the world completely, this effort. However, in my years of practice with the method, I've concluded that certain essential elements are missing. And here is a partial list of additions to these conflict resolution processes that I imagine would make a significant difference. First, influencers, that is, anybody with any influence who is working on these conflicts, need to publicly acknowledge and also acknowledge in the media the historical and current reality of the immense psychological and material impacts of accumulated traumas at the collective level. Facilitators and others who address these conflicts need to work with and process collective trauma, both in facilitated small elite meetings, but also in public meetings facilitated in some way and on media platforms. 3, facilitators should include on their teams trauma specialists who would help analyze the situation, frame interventions, and process what is said in the encounters. Influencers and facilitators should forcefully and repeatedly publicly acknowledge and name vested interests profiting from these conflicts and ask how they can ever be countered. Whatever consensus our world currently offers about collective morality, I think is best expressed in the human rights provisions of international law and understandings, even though such rights have yet to inform many international and intercommunal relationships. In other words, the context for my proposals that I've just read is a world still largely dominated by raw power. The long unresolved conflicts, primarily discussed in my book, dominate the relations among Turks, Armenians, and Azerbaijanis. And these relations have not moved toward sustainable and productive resolution for close to or more than a century. Traumas found in the relevant history of these relationships will be familiar. And here they are, some of them: damage to homelands, loss of homelands, lack of justice, unkept agreements, genocide, ethnic cleansing, slavery, ongoing discrimination, total war, and some of the changes associated with climate change. In one simple phrase, traumas are imposed power and take these different forms of it. Trauma experienced by large numbers of individuals is, of course, part of what constitutes collective traumas. But collective traumas entail losses and injuries beyond the effect on individuals. They loosen, if not destroy, the trust holding a society together, and they may destroy the functioning of society's institutions, and usually do to some degree. And that has led to anarchy and chaos. My book acknowledges, controversially for some, that more powerful parties involved in these conflicts may also face overwhelming and terrifying threat or trauma. In discussing the Ottoman Empire from the 19th century until its final demise, my book identifies many causes leading to it, including the rise of Europe, which is always identified. The empire faced loss of imperial lands, of economic health, and possibly of all their sovereignty over even their homeland. Many Ottoman elites and ordinary Muslim citizens became very poor and anticipated further decline. Moreover, Ottomans faced loss of their assumed inherent superiority, manifested materially and deeply felt psychologically. Until this moment in Ottoman history, Armenians and Turks had coexisted for centuries. Armenians were well integrated, but always as inferior. Then in the 19th century, Armenians became more educated, wealthier, and more modern class by class than the Muslims. The psychologically minded historian Taner Akşam observed the loss of superior status had shaken the Muslims' confidence, which resulted in the loss of their tolerance. Armenians now became scapegoats for Ottoman problems. So the Ottomans passed it on, their frustration and terror, to the Armenians. If Armenians then were weaker in relation to Europe, they were more powerful than the Armenians. A piece of this story of proportionate power relations is that shortly before the Armenian Genocide, the Muslims of the Balkans fled to Anatolia from the Balkans' Christian populations. The latter, those Christian populations, had become powerful enough to expel their Ottoman overlords. The Muslims, fleeing from their homes in the Balkans, in turn, where they had lived for hundreds of years in their communities, lost everything. They arrived traumatized and impoverished, but a year later, the genocide had begun, the genocide of Armenians, and Armenians had either been slaughtered or sent on death marches. And as a result, many of these Balkan Christian refugees were assigned to Armenian property in Anatolia, where they also now formed the core of the new Turkish nation. This mix of collective traumas, some far more damaging than others, are at the ultimate human center of these conflicts and therefore must be acknowledged and addressed. However, traumas experienced by the more powerful and immorally righteous, like those responsible for the Armenian Genocide, greatly complicate our intuitive or gut understanding that we should feel sympathy or empathy for anyone who survives trauma. Now, my book offers an illustration from a different context that may be more, or maybe rather less jarring to consider. Upon return to the United States, a cohort of American soldiers who had come back from foreign wars where they had acted upon orders to kill the enemy faced a psychological crisis that they had because they had acted upon orders to kill the enemy in these wars. They faced a psychological crisis that they related to, that they told, and they're especially thoughtful psychiatrists, the killing of others had left them without a conscience. Thus, a newly identified mental concern led the psychiatrist to create a new diagnostic category: trauma-induced moral injury. Now, please allow me to ask you 3 questions. Is it naive of me to speak of morality here? Is commitment to transformation of destructive relations into productive relations ultimately inseparable from issues of morality? Or should questions of the relationship of them be sidestepped, of bringing morality into it? Should that be sidestepped? Now, I stated my own view early on in my book. And here it is briefly, and it was brief in the book. I view morality as part of human biology and relational and collective psychology, although science cannot yet tell us how all this works and may never be able to. I hold the infliction of collective traumas to be immoral because they destroy achievements of hard and soft-wired human evolution and possibilities for all to survive and thrive. I conclude that the exercise of conscience is essential. So moral issues are essential. Now, I went on then to quote the protagonist in a novel by the British writer Martin Amis, and it's called The House of Meetings. He had spent years in a Soviet labor camp, and he wrote, and this character said to his other companion, prisoner in the labor camp, "That's the other feature of national life, a permanent desperation. We will never have the luxury of confession and remorse." But what if it isn't a luxury, he asks? What if it is a necessity? The conscience, I expect, is a vital organ. And when it goes, you go. So now we look at this. This slide shows the 4 parts of my book. And in my remarks to this point, I've taken you into my book's introduction and the first part of the 4 parts of the book. Now, a little more about part 1. And it's about trauma and the psychology of trauma, personal and collective. The word trauma is what, but in general, now I'm speaking, not, this, I also say the word trauma is widely and loosely used. So let's unpack it just a little. Trauma is an objectively perceivable, terrifying event or situation. It's an event. It's in the world. Trauma adds up to being imposed power. A trauma is also the threat of either. But subjectively, we experience traumas as overwhelming, but that's a subjective experience. However, individuals who have been overwhelmed by traumatic events do not always become traumatized. As a matter of medical diagnosis, to be traumatized is to experience certain symptoms over time, that is, post the trauma. Symptoms such as nightmares and repetitive intrusive thoughts about the traumatic experience. Medically speaking, then, traumatization occurs when the traumatic experience continues to be haunting in certain identifiable symptoms. Part 1 of my book describes these symptoms, personal and collective, and it was the effects of trauma or these symptoms living on inside those who had the experience involved in dealing with these conflicts that led me to write this book. I've witnessed that these effects, which were unacknowledged, unprocessed, and altogether unhealed, predictably, insidiously, or blatantly interfered in conflict resolution efforts. This happened when the traumatic events were brought up for discussion and when inevitably the profound fears and other strong emotions associated with the trauma were automatically and naturally triggered. They're involuntary and the most natural thing, unfortunately, that there is. This is how being traumatized interferes with our thinking and with the best use of our minds when we try to resolve these problems. So I emphasize in the book that individuals often react differently, however, after exposure to the very same traumatic event. Some do not become traumatized at all. Others are traumatized to different degrees. And these differences are the result of different past experiences, the age when you're exposed, your genetics, and whether you or your whole people possess sufficient strength to destroy or flee from the threat. All these factors affect if and how individuals and collectivities are traumatized and how they remember the events, as illustrated by the names of 2 chapters in my book, Meaning Making with Trauma and Relative Powerlessness in the Armenian People as a Whole, compared to a chapter called Meaning Making with Trauma and Relative Power Among Turks. They're quite different. So parts 2 and 3 are about the history between Armenians and other peoples in the homelands of Anatolia and the South Caucasus. Part 2 lays out a history of the relations between Armenians and Turks since 1839, starting with the role and importance of Anatolian homelands. Now, predating the arrival of Turkic tribes, Armenians had lived across Anatolia and in substantial numbers in the adjacent area of what today is known as the South Caucasus. And maybe, Armin, it's the moment to show for a minute the photograph showing a building, a church that has been built. Well, this was built actually just before the Turkic tribes arrived. And there were many predating that, and they are a substantial relic of, well, I mean to say a substantial number of them of predating, I should say this in front of the world expert on the topic, but they're magnificent, underappreciated architectural masterpieces. And I've had the privilege of seeing a number of them. So, and this was predating the arrival of the Turkic tribes. And when the Armenians had lived, we can go back to the map, had lived across Anatolia and also in substantial numbers in the adjoining Russian Empire, part of the Russian Empire. Now, both peoples, the Armenians and the Turks, knew who they were, partly because of where they lived. The homelands and lands they inhabited as communities, they called homelands. Homelands were integral to their collective identities, and homelands matter. And perhaps most well known today, now speaking outside my book, to the examples of the Ukrainians and the Jews. The latter maintained their reverence for homeland, lost to them some 2,000 years before the state of Israel was founded there in 1948. By 1948, however, that homeland had also long been the beloved homeland of the Palestinian people. The importance of the threat of loss of homelands is analogous to bodily injury. The word dismemberment refers both to loss of limbs of living beings and to loss of the territory of the homeland or part of the homeland belonging to a people. Part 1 of my book proceeds to trace now the demise of the Ottoman Empire, when that empire, already stressed, embarked on a series of reforms in 1839, known as the Tanzimat, to improve its situation. The reform period culminated in 1876 with the Constitution, giving rights for the different ethnicities within the empire, for all of them, including the Ottoman Armenians, brightening their hopes and prospects in the empire. Meanwhile, stress on the Ottoman Empire piled on. And nonetheless, in spite of the discrimination against Armenians, the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire were doing visibly better than the Armenians. With the Constitution, Armenians became members of the new parliament and demanded their right to be treated fairly under the law. However, the Tanzimat reforms had not changed Ottoman Muslims' attitudes toward Armenians. Rather, the rights Armenians received under the reforms and their subsequent changing assumptions threatened the Muslim population's status as inherently superior, and a superior that their religion taught them that they were entitled to. For a certain subset of the Armenian population, the Armenian rise was perceived then as a substantial threat, a traumatic threat to the empire's future, both materially and psychologically. Ottoman Armenians were now in jeopardy. Large and small massacres of them occurred for about 2 decades before the Armenian Genocide began in 1914. Part 2 also explores the trauma in the lives of 5 actors, 3 of whom held the top offices in the Ottoman government at the time. The 2 others were close associates. Each of them was responsible for either conceiving or carrying out the genocide, each of them. And they were the leading, most powerful people in the entire empire at that time. Now, I looked at their individual backgrounds and learned that each of them separately and individual and differently from each other had been traumatized before taking office by events or situations relating to the demise of the empire. These men, it's all in the book, and these men as adults and holding high office, although having been traumatized, and no doubt partly because of their traumatization and that experience of the trauma, perpetrated unforgivable crimes. So I included this information about them in my book and here to demonstrate that trauma's impact is at once personal and collective, and that it is commonly present and determinative, if better disguised, in the psychology of many of history's leading actors, as well as in the poor and uninfluential. I also understand if these thoughts about the trauma experienced by criminal heads and their cohorts offend some of you. It took me decades of psychological work to be able to try dispassionately to make sense of immense wrongs. About some things, it is still very difficult for me. And even about these people, I can get very, very angry and upset, but I can also step away from it. Part 2 concludes that with a lengthy chapter about the Armenian Genocide, at least the main phase, but I'm not going to talk about it here because the facts surrounding approximately 1 million deaths are well known and easy to access. And after so much that I've been saying about trauma, you may be surprised that the history I narrate in parts 1 and 2 is not solely studded with traumas, and that I wrote about influential figures who attempted to improve the situation for the involved peoples. Let's take Prince Mehmet Sabahaddin, a close relative of the Sultan, who had disappeared by the time Sabahaddin. No, that's not true. He hadn't disappeared by the time Sabahaddin went to Paris and became a sociologist and had his thinking shaped. But not long before the genocide and after the disappearance of the Sultan, the prince pressured for further decentralization of the empire, which included giving Armenians local autonomy in Eastern Anatolia for the purpose of holding the empire together. With similar intent, I also highlight the activities of some leading Armenians. Just for a few years and just before the genocide, Krikor Zorab had been enjoying participation as an equal under the Ottoman constitution, and he was elected to the Chamber of Deputies. Widely recognized as principled and very, very able, he was popular with the other Armenian deputies who had legal backgrounds, and in fact, he had trained many of them. So he promoted tolerance and cooperation between Muslims and Christians, and he proclaimed that our common religion is freedom. Nevertheless, he was murdered early on in the genocide. Part 3 lays out the history from around 1900 to 1918 of Armenian, Turkish, and Azeri relations in what is today known as the South Caucasus, but then was part of the Russian Empire. Relations between Armenians and Azeris took a somewhat different trajectory from that between Armenians and Turks, or it had done over time. But by the late 1890s, the Tsar came down hard, but not murderously, on Russian Armenians. 1905 saw serious clashes and massacres break out in the South Caucasus between the two. However, from the view of Ismail Ziadkanov, a Muslim from the city then called Elizabethpol, now Gonsha, and he was a member of the newly instituted State Duma in St. Petersburg. That enmity between the two peoples, the Armenians and the Azeris, was the result of manipulation by Russian authorities. Fast forward to World War I with focus on the territory between the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire, known as the Borderlands. It was a brutal background where a mutual massacring of Armenians had taken place since the war began. Then, following the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 and related events, the South Caucasus turned anarchic. Massacres continued until the end of the war. Just before, in March, Armenians murdered about 3,000 Muslim civilians in Baku. And in late August, when the Ottoman army arrived there in Baku, Ottoman soldiers and Azeris, both military and civilian, murdered some 20,000 Armenian residents. Now, by the 1920s, the new Soviet government had retaken the territory in the South Caucasus that had previously been part of the Russian Empire. And the Soviets then assigned an enclave, Karabakh, located between the new states, the newly declared nation states of Armenia and Azerbaijan, to Azerbaijan. It was this enclave, which had probably historically was definitely lived in by both, perhaps by more Armenians. During the decades of the Soviet period, Karabakh was not witness to ethnic violence. However, as soon as the Soviet Union broke apart in 1991, a war between Armenians and Azerbaijanis, now called, over Karabakh led to an Armenian victory that included the traumas of major ethnic cleansing of Azerbaijanis from Armenia and Karabakh, and of Armenians from Azerbaijan. The majority of the Armenian population of Karabakh has never accepted thereafter its assignment by the Soviets to Azerbaijani rule. Today, these traumatic events compose important moments in the history that led to today's humanitarian crisis and dangerous situation in the South Caucasus. In 2020, Azerbaijan acted on its long-held claim of territorial jurisdiction, and it seized parts of Karabakh, which the Armenians had held onto in spite of the fact that it had been assigned to Azerbaijan. Part 4's opening chapter tells us how very dangerous it predictably is today to challenge stereotypes in Armenia's or Turkey's popular narratives about the other or themselves. This chapter does this by looking at two individuals and analyzes the stage of their holistic psychological development, which I was trained to do in my doctoral work. One of the persons is an Armenian American, Melanie Tumani, and the other is a Turkish woman, Ece Temulkuran. Each authored a book challenging her people's narrative from what was written in their books, and the books came out just before the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. I could assess their level of development, which was impressive. While both books sold well, each was the object of vile and ugly attacks by individuals from their respective communities who were offended by the questioning of aspects of their narratives. The over-the-top reactions to these books touch nerves made sensitive by completely unhealed collective traumas in both peoples. They suggest how complex and tricky it is to resolve conflicts and take the steps to make peace with the other, and the high level of personal development it requires to begin to be able to do that. The remainder of Part 1 analyzes relations between Armenians, Turks, and Azerbaijanis today and proposes steps at the collective level based on the elements I mentioned at the start of this talk as missing in conflict resolution work. Now, I'm wondering if we should stop here and then possibly pick up on more, but we'll see. What do you think?
Should we move to asking questions from the audience?
Or maybe I should just complete.
I think that's a much better. And then
Okay. At this point of the standoff in the conflict and relations between Azerbaijanis today and Armenians in the South Caucasus, and the Azerbaijanis very supported by the Turks and what they're doing, and supported in every way. Conflict resolution processes offer unique opportunity for parties to reach true understanding of each other at all levels of society. How would those conflict resolutions go? Is there evidence, as I claim in my book documents and the encounters I've facilitated, that the effects of trauma is traumatization, is that the effects of traumatization negatively affects the process? If you, when the topic of genocide is raised, as the Turkish historian who acknowledges the Armenian genocide noted at meetings that he was present at, he said, if you say, yes, there was genocide, the Armenians cheer you and the Turks boo you. And everybody stops listening because they heard what they came to hear. And if you say, no, it was not genocide, exactly the reverse happens. The Armenians boo, the Turks cheer. And again, everybody stops listening. How, he asked, can we liberate the present from being captive in bondage to the ghosts of 1915? How can we liberate the present from being captive to the past and learn from it? End quote. Now, I immediately recognized Berktay's description as accurate. Even if facilitators interrupt such back and forths, neither they nor participants are likely to call for and validate expression of the underlying emotions to react in reactions like booing or not listening. At such moments, Turks feel certain emotions that lie beneath their denial of the facts. They feel offended and ashamed and that their honor is insulted. They will speak resentfully and contemptuously of Armenians rather than admit regret. Armenians' emotions include underlying rage at the injustice and the ultimate pain and grief that follow genocide, and by Turkish denial of it. Their feelings reflect being profoundly offended and damaged because the criminals who got away with it, because the criminals got away with it because of their superior power. These emotions need to be worked with. And I think I will end here. I give an example in the book, but we can talk about that. Thank you for listening and being here.
All right. I always enjoy the role of the moderator because it requires the least amount of work to do on a panel like this. So, Pam, thank you very much for this very stimulating conversation on this subject. Maybe I can get the ball rolling and we can open up the questions to the rest of the audience. But as somebody who works in the field of history, I think that oftentimes we do not take into consideration the roles that emotions and the psychological states of the people that we're studying affect their decision making. Sometimes we do, but I think that we always are much more interested in perhaps empirical data or what the documents themselves say, rather than trying to, as you're very fond of the notion of like psychoanalyzing a certain individual or adopting a psychoanalytical lens to it. How do you see, you touched upon it during your presentation, but how do you see that field of knowledge, whether it's psychoanalysis, psychology, and its affiliated fields, improving our understanding of trauma, and how useful do you see it, or do you see any limitations to its applicability in these kinds of conflict-ridden areas?
So thank you for that big question. And I'm triggered because you mostly, understandably, because it's common enough and there are a million fields in psychology, my analysis is really not mostly psychoanalytic. psychoanalysis doesn't treat trauma as primarily related to hard events in the way that trauma psychology, which builds on psychoanalysis enormously and relies on it for a way to get to deep understanding, but nevertheless moves quite a long way beyond it and looks for exterior events as what needs to be connected to individuals' feelings and body experiences to heal from trauma. And that's a vast jump from psychoanalytic work, but it's reliant on a lot of psychoanalytic work. So now your big important question is, what does my perspective offer? And does it cover everything? And no, it doesn't. Healing and dealing with these long-standing conflicts that are long-standing for reasons involves just almost every discipline there is. Yeah, I mean, because wars touch everything in a life. And that's why I'm in my proposals, I urge that people in international affairs who address these conflicts bring trauma psychologists into the mix of dealing with them. It's an interdisciplinary effort to begin to address these conflicts. But what also upsets me a lot is that there is this assumption that because they've taken forever to address, that forever is needed to address them. And I don't think it is. I think that there's this vast divide between what psychotherapy type work can offer in helping people move beyond their pain, which is what gets involved in conflict resolution work all the time and makes it hard to move anywhere. Equally, though, they can't move beyond the pain unless there's justice. And that requires non-psychological work in courts of law and in holding people accountable for crimes. So those two, are very different enterprises and usually are thought of as separate. That if you go after people in court, well, you can't expect them to sit down with you in a conflict resolution session and show some understanding and empathy because you're going after them in court. Is Alvin Bragg going to sit down with Donald Trump and expect Donald, no. But nonetheless, with these conflicts, loads and loads of people are involved. And I made a proposal before I wrote this book to the U.S. Institute of Peace for holding many, many large public meetings dealing with that particular conflict. Having held a successful one myself here at Harvard in this building on the ground floor with over 200 people, and something moved in that. And that inspired me to make this proposal to the USIP, but they said, write more. And I ended up writing the book. They were interested, but that's what happened. Now I'm too old to do more. But I think it's possible, but the two have to be understood as necessary, the two being healing, which requires psychological work, and justice, which requires other kinds of parties and institutions and professional efforts.
Great, thank you. Does anybody in the audience have any questions they'd like to pose?
Come to a wonderful family. Big family, important family.
Or are there questions on the?
No questions. No questions.
Well, we get to go.
I'm curious, because I work for the program on Georgian studies, if anything involving Georgia comes up in this conversation, because it is the third country in the South Caucasus.
Sure. That's a great question. I did talk about Georgia in my book a bit. And what struck me was that Georgia looked out completely understandably for Georgia at the end of World War I. And I can't remember exactly how that manifested itself, but I don't, maybe you can tell me, but before the very end of the war, there was the whole South Caucasus was like a cauldron of things jumping around and nobody knew what was going on. The Armenians, the Azerbaijanis, and the Georgians briefly formed a union. And they didn't know whether to be independent as a union from Russia, which was in transition still from, it hadn't decided if it was white or red. So should they be independent from Soviet authorities, which were in place by then, or should they form their own union? And Georgia was one of the ones that broke away from that union, broke away from that little union that existed very briefly the quickest. So it seemed to have the most interest or the least interest in working with the others. But other commentators have commented that a union among Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan could make a lot of sense because the South Caucasus is its own region in a way. And well, the relations are terrible, but if people could imagine them, there is a counter because those three countries or those three peoples are in these borderlands between what was the Ottoman Empire and what was the Russian Empire. And when they were for always being squeezed and manipulated by both of them. So that, and used, they weren't respected, the peoples. They were just part of those bigger empires and served their interests as best the empires could make them. So there is a case for some unity.
Well, I first want to thank Dr. Steiner for doing all this work. No one is ever too old to bring this inspiring work to the table and inspire new generations of people. So thank you for doing this. I do have a question.
Good. I forgot.
I heard about your wonderful work of bringing people to the table and involving them at not just the victims level, but the people who are the decision makers, the peacemakers, the ones who could impact that process. Has any of this work involved in recent work any psychedelic work by those same parties, as is now being used with veterans and in a number of fields?
No. But it's surely the next step. I think it's a great idea. I really do. I mean, it would be worth trying.
Mhm.
It might be a shortcut. You said psychedelic, right?
Yes, absolutely.
It could be a kind of bypass, and it might prevent the dealing with the full meaning that has been made of these conflicts. But it also could be helpful in getting people to a place where they could step away from their own emotional involvement for long enough to begin to see if there was some space that they might wish to fill. And also, I haven't done any of this psychedelic work, but I'm up for it. I am, because I think that I'm interested in the profound sense of wholeness that apparently can offer of oneself with the universe and other peoples. And God knows we need that on this planet fully right now. So, great question.
Thank you for this question.
I can also just ask one more question, Pam. When you do encounter impasses during these, for example, conflict resolution meetings, say between Israelis and Palestinians, if you do bring them into a room together, or between Armenians and Azerbaijanis, is empathy the main element that will allow people to move forward? And what happens when there is a refusal on either side or on both sides to see any justice in the other's position on why they've taken that stance?
Sure.
How do you overcome that?
Yeah, well, empathy is totally key. And again, there's a need for people who know how to work with empathy to be involved. And yes, we certainly have. In fact, my closest colleague in my work over many years is a professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts. And we wrote an article at least 10 years, it's a chapter in a book, but it's available online. It's still regularly read by people, about a series of workshops that we did with Palestinian citizens of Israel and Israelis. And over time, they did come to quite a lot of deep understanding. Took time, 3 sessions, at different times. And they came to some understanding, and they worked together on making a village reflective of good intentions on both sides. The trouble is, it was one tiny example, and there are many such examples, including in Turkey and or maybe Armenia. I doubt it in Azerbaijan, but maybe. There are some people of goodwill in Azerbaijan, including their greatest novelist alive, whose book is quite wonderful. So it is desperately needed, and it can work. It's essential. And you don't want, and I don't know if psychedelic work would, it's not a substitute for it, because I remember reading something about it where the people who had learned about it, it was a whole book about the recent psychedelic movement, and the people who had gained this perspective about other people then demonstrated much less than that when they were faced with difficult situations. So, and there's really no bypass to both, but there are different values you can get, different growing from both. So it's a huge enterprise to make good. It's, to improve relations, but it is possible. And God knows, although it looks as though it takes tons of time and money, that is in comparison to the time and money taken to resolve conflicts. Most of the time and money goes to weapons and all of that. And that is why I think that, relatively speaking, people like me, but not, who are high up and have a voice in this world, can have an out of proportion impact if they say some of these things, even though they don't have the time and money devoted at their disposal, devoted to weapons and fighting and that. So I think that's why my proposals at the beginning are pretty radical, but I think that if they could be, I think young people get it. They're fundamental change is essential. Some young people. What do you think?
Yeah, I've been recently reading a lot of psychedelic research as well for a paper, and I've just been wondering how does the patients or the the patient who want to take psychedelic see themselves perhaps holding accountabilities onto themselves when they take it? Does that seem like their trauma has been perhaps induced by collective or a communal version, which is something I find pretty interesting for this wave of
Can you, I didn't hear every word, I'm sorry.
If I understood you correctly,
say it loud.
How does a patient who elects to take psychedelics assume the responsibilities that are involved with that? Well,
I think that it's going to be the rare person who spends a lot of time in psychotherapy who is up for this kind of effort. But, you know, tons of people go into therapy. I mean, tons, maybe everybody in the room, for all I know, has been at one time or other. Most of us, I certainly have been, and thank God for it. But I think that one looks, you know, they're the best candidates, but maybe not likely. I mean, but certainly, you know, most people I run into in this international type field, anything that smacks of therapy, you know, not me, which is very wrong. I mean, and they may well be in therapy just as they do it, you know, so I don't know what to say about that. But you know, there's a huge prejudice there that should be addressed and overcome. Because therapy is a miracle, really. Please, and say it as loud as you can, because
also thank you so much for your presentation. I found it really also inspiring. Which and myself, I am in the trans school of public health as well.
From where?
Trans school of public health.
From the
You are. Oh, great.
Yes, I'm studying like epidemiology and also secondary and humanitarian studies. So I'm actually really curious about like what you mentioned as this like trauma that perceived on a collective level, and what I see perhaps in research or in paper, there are a lot of challenges people who work at the front line are facing, which is like how to adapt like this Western or Eurocentric mode of therapy, which is focusing on the individual perceived of trauma, how to adapt it into like more communal, community-based collective trauma. So I'm really curious about it.
So was there a question in that?
Yeah. So how does again, I'm sorry if I misremember, but how does treating collective trauma differ than the approaches that have been based just on individuals? Is that correct? Yeah.
That's such an important and difficult question. Basically, it's going to be the same, except that with people who are recipients and suffering or been through collective traumas and peoples, you know, there's no reason it can't be done in large groups. A guru of a very dear friend and colleague who teaches at the Kennedy School, you know, told him, and he told me that his guru, who actually wrote it in a book he gave me, said all countries need to lose face together. And I think that's at the core of it. There is shame in so many. I mean, most people on the planet are brought up to, as children, to follow some version of the 10 Commandments or the Golden Rule or something. So people know, they become morally injured and justify it. People at the top all the time, but they've got to be held accountable. And the accountability involves embarrassment in public if they think it's embarrassing, which they will, and we all do, me too, to admit the problems one has had and suffered from upstairs, you know, with our thinking at times. I think it's got to be talked about and validated, but the treatment isn't the word, because that's got too much of a medical ring, I think. But it's, is there a non-medical term for treatment? I'm exploring here, so explore with me.
Yeah, I think like how trauma has been so medicalized in the recent decades, it's really interesting.
I think you're right.
The marginal discipline, like perhaps literature or like films that are on the margin of interpreting trauma. That's also really interesting.
I think that's marginalization. I think that's right. Because it overlaps, certainly whatever treatment there is for individuals who've been traumatized and those traumatized in collectivities. because you can't treat the collectivity. I mean, you can treat it through its individuals. So that will overlap. The two will overlap, but just how, there was a psychiatrist who was holding open meetings for people who wanted to talk about their experiences in collective trauma situations together. But they weren't people who came with any role on their backs where they were trying to help their collectivity as such. They came as individuals wanting to feel better. That's different.
But has it also been too pathologized? I think that's what she was asking.
For sure. Certainly, because yes, these reactions we have can happen to anybody. The pathology is not the right paradigm. It's not, it's the wrong paradigm, because symptoms of trauma have nothing to do with the individual coming from inside the individual as such. They just are biologically determined, and they vary a bit, but that's not due to anything except occasionally inherent in the individual. There are some genetic factors. We don't really know fully, though, where mental illness comes from, but we do tend to think that schizophrenia and severe bipolar illness is genetic. So those things have an effect on the degree of traumatization. But other than that, it's these external events that, as I understand it, impact the human biology, all human biology, in greater and lesser extent, different people. There's probably there are surely more factors. There's quite a lot written about this. But...
Henry, do you have?
Hello. I've wondered a lot about individual or collective trauma, and that's part of the question you were asking. And I take one of the examples you used, which was Palestinians and Jewish Israelis. And think of this distinction, if it is one. Wonder if it is one. Take a case of domestic sexual violence, abuse, aggression, crime, and it lands on an individual, let's assume, and that individual may be subject to trauma and traumatized. He or she is not entirely alone, but there are groups that are concerned with this problem. There are legislative proposals that are put forth. There are moralists who will talk of their deep questions of, was the victim really in some way an aggressor too, et cetera, et cetera. When I think of this at the collective level, doesn't something dramatic change? The individual does get in touch with whole groups that have different attitudes about this, and there may be big differences. But take the Israeli situation. We now have a very split Israel, almost 50-50. And as it grows to be collective, or as in the Armenian-Turkish case, does it become much more factionated so that it's not simply a unitary one against a unitary another? You committed a genocide against me. You were stealing all the wealth in my country, whatever the basic claims may be. So that you have the Yakudniks and further right, and you have the human rights types, etc. And even this country is split. So does that change the analysis of what the trauma is? The trauma is historically there. Jews were murdered by the Armenians and the Palestinians, even though they were ruled by the Turks and then by the British and so on and so forth, but were driven out by the Israelis, the most recent. and deprived of their homelands. So that it also becomes universalized in a way that draws in third-party powers who may, for their reasons, want the traumatic sides, the traumatized sides, to get to a solution, or this solution rather than that. So does it become a very different phenomenon? Is it each side has factions? The sides are quite different. A faction on one side may agree more with a faction on the other side than with its own side's different faction, and so on.
Yeah, maybe, but when they get together, they will go back to probably the things that have not been settled from the origins. But maybe not. But it's amazing how that will, it goes both ways. When we do the conflict resolution workshops, when we did, and you work with the one party first, the facilitation team would work, say, with the Israelis, Jews first. Then we work with the Palestinians, or first with Armenians and then with Turks in a room by themselves first. And what we find is a lot of differences among them in that room, which no doubt represent different factions that have developed within the large societies. But when you bring them together, it takes quite a while for them to break up and go across to the other side. But, they're endless. Yes. So it gets very complicated, but somehow something core remains, even though, as I said at the beginning, I did simplify here. You have to.
Well, what remains might be in that situation the perhaps irrepressible deep desire, whether or not expressed and made an active argument, of some who feel they've been forever deprived of something that was very important to them, simply gone, and what can be done. And by another who feels the same thing, but in a different time frame. So though they're willing to come to different compromises or solutions, they still have that deep feeling of an historical crime, historical evidence.
Yeah. It's true. I mean, but people, you could, maybe the activists continue to feel it more than others. I think that has been shown. There's studies about that. The people with families who have escaped, but a few generations later, but if they're, or even recently, they are going to be at the core of people trying to bring recognition of the problem and justice. And mostly are not asking for understanding or empathy, but that's why you have to kind of build processes to bring that in. If you want to get to more than just ceasefire, which isn't very productive or friendly or life enhancing, you want to get to people having an opportunity to have a wonderful life and together. Wouldn't that be nice? But we got to go for these things. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for showing up here today and also on the live stream. And thank you, Pam, for providing us this, again, very fascinating conversation on how we think and process experiences translates into our own actions.
Yeah.